So I'm here to talk about HIV/AIDS denialism, specifically as it pertains to the development of the HIV epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa and South Africa specifically. Before I really get into the details and the history of that, I want to talk a little bit about what HIV/AIDS denialism is and give a little bit of a historical context about the HIV epidemic in general. HIV became relevant in the late 80s when it was discovered to be the cause of AIDS, which was noted in the early 80s. And from there, it became a global epidemic. And coinciding with that discovery, of course, there were dissidents and denialists of that same science. So these HIV/AIDS denialists...
Would you like me to off the lines?
Sure, if it's easier for you guys to see.
Oh, work better for the...
Is that okay? I think you're right.
Is that okay for the camera? All right. So if you don't know how HIV works, it's essentially a virus that attacks part of your immune system in order to perpetuate itself. And it's a sexually transmitted disease. AIDS denialism is characterized by a number of claims and various characteristics. First and foremost of which is that HIV does not cause acquired immune deficiency syndrome. As to what does cause it, there's a variety of ideas in the AIDS denialist culture, but essentially HIV is either harmless, does not exist. AIDS is due to many other diseases, due to poverty, things like that. So as far as what else it's caused by, there's a lot of theories in the AIDS denialist communities. There's no real agreement, and different theories seem to coincide with the kind of person who's making these claims and the context that they're making them in. One example is poverty. When HIV was first noted outside of the U.S., in particular, in a lot of third world countries and developing countries, the poor were predominantly affected. Poverty is associated with increases in crime rates, lack of education, lack of access to health care, lack of access to contraceptives. So it makes sense that an STD that nobody knows about would spread much more quickly in these populations. Nonetheless, how poverty itself would cause the symptoms of the disease, I'm not quite sure. The other one is poor nutrition. Many dissidents believe that these symptoms in poor communities were due actually to just not eating the right foods or not eating enough food. This was a symptom of starvation and malnutrition rather than of a viral disorder. Last but not least, not really last, but interestingly, many people accused it of the wrath of a homophobic patriarch or of some great government anti-gay conspiracy. There were actually organizations in the U.S. Based in San Francisco which held this position that it was a government conspiracy that was developed to or against the homosexual community. So these are just some of the prominent ones that you see quite a bit, and some of the ones that are more relevant to what we're eventually going to talk about. AIDS denialism is usually associated with other characteristics. It's not defined by them or necessarily inclusive with them, but it's very common to see these things. AIDS denialism is an anti-science, anti-intellectual position, and so it often coincides with other anti-science positions, one of which is complementary and alternative medicine. It's very, very common for AIDS denialists to support the views of complementary and alternative medicine. This idea that the pharmaceutical industry is a bad guy, looking only for profits, taking advantage of people, lying whenever it can to get away with it. This is very common in CAM communities, that the truth is being suppressed. And so you see this a lot. It's not just a claim about fact. It's not a claim that HIV does not cause AIDS. There's a whole culture associated with it, a paranoia about the scientific establishment, and a victimization. So like I said, conspiracy theories about Western medical establishment. This is extremely important when it comes to South Africa. It's probably the most important thing to keep in mind when we're considering the development of AIDS and the role of denialism in South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. Primarily to keep in mind is that when we talk about the Western establishment in South Africa, it has an entirely different connotation of what we mean here. We think of rich, greedy companies who don't care about poor citizens. In post-apartheid South Africa, the Western establishment represents it has a racial connotation. It's associated with colonialism, Western ideology, and oppression. So it's important to keep that in mind, that when they talk about the Western establishment, or when they present it as us in South African communities and sub-Saharan African communities, they don't mean it in the same context that we mean it when we talk about it here. Another characteristic is fallacious reasoning. AIDS, dissidents, and denialists, some of which do have scientific qualifications, often cherry-pick data. They cite studies, like this one, for example, which the author of does not support AIDS denialism. He accepts the idea that HIV is the cause of AIDS, and this paper is simply looking at some of the empty spaces in our knowledge about the specific mechanisms of infection. AIDS dissidents love citing this paper all the time to show that there's no scientific consensus. And it's simply not the case. This is not an example of a lack of scientific consensus. The fact is that there are very, very, very few scientists who reject that HIV is the cause of AIDS, and even fewer still anyone with relevant expertise in virology or pathogenesis or anything remotely related to an understanding of HIV and AIDS. One thing I want to make clear when I move forward here, because I'm going to be, I think what I find very shocking, pointing out what I find to be very shocking facts, is that HIV/AIDS denialists are not necessarily anarchists. They're not bad people. They're not out to screw the establishment or take advantage of anybody. I think that the majority of AIDS denialists are perfectly honest people, and despite some of the results of AIDS denialism, I don't necessarily hold them accountable in the way I would say of Hitler, who maliciously murdered the Jews. This is not quite the same. Denialism is a psychological phenomenon, one that we all go through. It's very normal, it's very healthy if it goes the right way. When you're diagnosed with cancer or some sort of fatal disease, we go through a process of denialism. When we face the death of a loved one, we go through this process. And if that process is maladaptive, it results in a poor psychological response. This is something we're all capable of. The denialists in these stories are no different from the rest of us. They're dealing with the issue is simply maladaptive. And a vast number of people could be in the same situation and have made the same decisions. So these are not horrible examples of humanity's worst people. These are normal people in sort of extraordinary circumstances. And that's a very important point I want to make. These are not the extreme fringes of society. And again, speaking of the context of Africa, to say that their history was somewhat traumatic would be an understatement. This is not... There are reasons and societal factors that caused some of this denialism, promoted it, primed it, and readied it, so that it was almost inevitable that HIV denialism would play a major role in developing HIV epidemic. So, I mentioned the apartheid. Now I want to go back into South Africa, where HIV started. Well, HIV didn't start in South Africa, where our story about HIV starts. HIV, the origins of HIV are from simian or chimpanzees in the region of Congo in the 1930s or maybe as early as the 1890s. From there, the disease is not prominent. The virus spreads in human populations, and by the 40s or 50s, it's estimated that maybe about 2,000 people were infected. Isolated populations in an underpopulated Africa, agricultural communities, it's not yet an epidemic. There are a few outbreaks that are misidentified or attributed to other diseases as late as the 1960s, killing dozens or tens of dozens of people. One such example would be Slim disease, which was in northeastern Africa, not north, but mid-eastern Africa. It would only be realized later that this was some of HIV first rearing its ugly head. Now, under the apartheid, which did not fall until 1993, whereas AIDS was first noticed in South Africa and around and other places in the world as early as 1981, I believe. And a viral agent was suspected around 1985 and confirmed conclusively by 1988. I think 2 strains had been confirmed at that time. At the time, many other African communities had responded to the epidemic as best they could given their resources. In South Africa, however, under apartheid rule, the response was essentially non-existent. The apartheid governing body ignored the problem because it affected poor people, it affected malnourished people, it affected sexually promiscuous people, it affected people who did not have access to contraceptives, and in an apartheid-governed country, that's black people. So, this was a black people problem. It was the poor people. The white people didn't need to worry about it. White people were in charge. They were running the healthcare system. And so the issue was really not acknowledged until 1992, when some AIDS response programs by the government were deployed, but mostly under international pressure and the realization that this was a global epidemic rather than just an issue they didn't need to worry about. In 1993, the liberation movement happened. HIV was not a major concern during the liberation movement. They were fighting to oust the apartheid and establish a new government, the African National Congress. You've probably heard the name Nelson Mandela. He ended up becoming the first president of South Africa in 1993, 1994. Dealing with HIV at the time was understandably not on his radar, or really much of the liberation movement's radar. They were just preoccupied. So the apartheid didn't care. The initial foundations of the African National Congress in South Africa were simply too distracted. And so the people dedicated to solving and investigating the problem in South Africa were either not equipped to, not given the resources to, or simply did not have the understanding or knowledge to deal with the problem. So in this way, South Africa was the worst possible country to have a proximity to the origin of this virus, geographically speaking. Because of the apartheid rule, we had many sex workers, migrant labor workers, undereducated people, high incidences of rape. It was almost seems, in retrospect, engineered. And I don't want to say that literally because obviously it was not. It's simply an unfortunate coincidence. So one of the first incidents I want to talk about, and this one's especially important because I think it frames the context of the denialist governing body of the essentially the executive branch of the African government, 1994 and onwards. It establishes all the patterns that we see in later incidents. This one is kind of it shows us what we can expect to come. And it's just the first sign of all the ugliness that would follow. So the Virodene saga, or the Virodene incident, essentially describes what would be called a miracle cure for AIDS by the people trying to, well, I don't want to say it's discoverers, the people who felt very strongly that it would work. And they touted it as a potential cure. They founded a company to manufacture it and develop its applications. This is a picture of Virodene. It's a very simple organic molecule. The chemical name is dimethylformamide, or DMF. I will refer to it thusly most of the time simply because once I explain to you exactly what it is, I think you'll be a little bit mortified. Anyway, the Visors, who are the individuals responsible for founding this company in order to develop these applications, were originally interested in using it to freeze organs and then unfreeze them so that they were still functional. In terms of organ transplants, this is extremely useful. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. At the time, Olga Weiser was a medical technician at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Her husband was a businessman. He's the one who founded this company. So neither of these people are experts in medical research. Being a medical technician is not the same as being a medical specialist trained to conduct medical trials. And being a businessman is certainly even further from that. So, didn't work out. Wasn't a viable business model. It wasn't useful. Seemed okay in animal models, but for people, not so great. But Olga Weiser seemed to notice that the substance had antiviral properties. I did some digging, and I didn't have time to change this, but I found some of her original notes. And what she actually said was antibacterial, and that she suspected that perhaps it would be applicable to HIV, which is a virus. This is a leap in judgment that no one with any expertise in biology or virology would ever make. There's no reason to think that an antibacterial agent would be antiviral, at least not in vivo, not in a human body. Obviously, fire is both, but not inside you. So she thought that perhaps that would work. Also, when she alludes to these antiviral properties, the means by which she noted them are, I couldn't find them. I don't know if she did some kind of genetic analysis to identify an increase or decrease in viral load. I don't know how she confirmed the presence of a viral load in the organs before or after during her experimentation with animal organs. Simply put, she seemed to kind of pull it out of thin air. There was a vague suspicion, probably prompted by her husband, to develop a new business model in response to, in Africa, what at the time was seen as a potential market, but also was on the tip of everybody's tongue. Everybody knew about it. It was the issue of the day. So, let the human trials begin. That might seem absurd to start human trials on the basis of a vague suspicion, injecting something into somebody's body that you're using to freeze organs with, but it was good enough for the Weisers, and they did just that without permission. They found 11 HIV-positive individuals in South Africa, got them to stop taking the medication that they did have, and then gave them this dimethylformamide in the form of a patch that absorbs through the skin. It's very quickly. And then they looked at the resulting mood of the patients. There was no real analysis as to the viral load of the patients or the presence of antibodies. In fact, they were so impressed with their results that they presented them to Thabo Mbeki, who at the time was the deputy president under Nelson Mandela and served that role from 1994 to 1999. He was very impressed. He thought this was great. This is a potential cure in his own country to face an HIV epidemic which seemed to have its epicenter in his home country. So this was great news. For someone in his position, of course, this is a very attractive idea. Almost too good to be true, in fact. And then he presented the idea to his health minister. I'll just call her Zuma. I won't attend to the rest. She's the Minister of Health, and she agreed to have these findings presented to the cabinet, the presidential cabinet, essentially the senior members of the elected branch, which includes Nelson Mandela and all of the various ministers of different departments. Unfortunately, the Minister of Health should have known better. And in fact, at the cabinet, she is the only medical expert. And she also supported the Weisers. Now, this presentation was essentially, go back, we'll see that one in a second, I have more to say. The Weisers presented their findings in the form of testimonials. They brought the patients directly to the cabinet and let them share their personal stories. Now, if you're the kind of person who responds to testimonials, this is great. These people aren't trained in medical research. We have these people who were sick and dying and poor, and now they feel great. They're revitalized. Their HIV is gone. Or, well, I should say their AIDS is gone, or so they felt as such. Unfortunately, this is not really a valid assessment of a cure. But the cabinet loved it. They were all behind it, including Zuma, shockingly, someone with a PhD in medical science. I don't know what her specific area of discipline is, but she does have a degree in medicine. So, they presented it as testimonials, and just a joke, 4 out of 5 taxi drivers agree, brain cancer is afraid of needles. This is not the kind of testimony that's useful in scientific discourse. It's a distraction, and as attractive as it may be, as much hope as it might inspire, these kinds of stories, although useful if applied the right way, ultimately lead those not trained in medical science to the wrong conclusion, and ultimately dangerous conclusions. And the real victims here are not the cabinet or the people who bought the Pfizer's BS, but the trial patients. They were given this compound, which there was no logical reason to suspect would do anything at all, and told to stop seeking other treatment options, to stop making informed decisions to prevent contracting HIV or giving HIV to others, and then told that they were cured. These people really believed it. They thought that they no longer had AIDS. They thought their lives were saved. This is the most tragic part, is the fools and suckers who were pulled into it to give these testimonies. They're the real victims. So, the appropriate medical authorities then found out that the cabinet had assessed this evidence and was in support of additional trials, and that trials on the 11 patients had been conducted without going through any proper regulatory medical channels. And the Medicines Control Council, that's the South African medical establishment, essentially, and basically said, no, stop, you can't do this. This is insane. They looked at the results of the trial and the compound being used, and they said, absolutely not. And the University of Pretoria reprimanded additional researchers associated with their university who participated in conducting the study. Now, why, aside from the fact that they were completely unscientific in their approach, why did the MCC react so quickly and so strongly to basically say you have to stop right now? Well, let's talk about what dimethylformamide is. It's a common industrial solvent used in many, many applications for the synthesis of other organic materials. Because of that, because of a higher risk of exposure in an industrial setting, in the appropriate industries, medical science has already been very interested in the cause of exposure to DMF. We already thought about it, and we did studies on it, very specific studies, looking at very specific loads over very specific amounts of times. The dangers of DMF are well known because it is in common use. And there are many, many people who go to work every day with the risk of exposure. And this was before HIV, before the term HIV ever existed. What is it known to do? Well, in high doses it causes abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea, nausea, and potentially fatal liver damage. What's really scary about this is that the advisors seem totally unaware of this. You see, throughout the conduct of their research and their presentation of their cure, Virodene, to their patients and to the cabinet and to the MCC when they were about to defend themselves, they never used the term dimethylformamide. They said Virodene. It's a proprietary, purified preparation. It's actually just DMF. So they falsified their presentation of their research, of the active agent. It's nothing more than an organic solvent that they administered to patients without medical approval and without the proper medical expertise to do it in the first place. What's really scary about this is in some of their notes, not in this trial, but additional medical trials that they continue to do in other countries without permission of the appropriate regulatory officials, they noted these side effects in many of their patients, which means that they were probably causing them liver damage. Once you start to feel these side effects, you're almost certainly getting liver damage. And the liver can repair itself, but these people aren't facing minimal short-term exposure. They're on a treatment plan, daily patches over the course of 3 months. The liver damage was probably severe and possibly fatal, We won't ever really know because the people they conducted it on were poor black people. So, as I said, evidence for DMF, in vivo antiviral properties, non-existent. Here's a quote from Ziggy Weiser some years later, after already conducting 3 illegal trials, quoted as saying, "We've double-dotted every I and double-crossed every T." This was in response to an accusation that they did not follow the proper regulatory pathways to test their medicine. And in response, this was said, and also that they were following the utmost criteria of ethics and science. I'm not sure they knew what those words meant. I and many others will not rest until the efficacy or otherwise of Virodene is established scientifically. If nothing else, all those infected by HIV/AIDS need to know as a matter of urgency. This was after the MCC, or in response to the MCC's denial of additional human trials. Again, Mbeki was the deputy president, and Mbeki, I'm missing an I at the end of his name, I apologize. He is not a scientist. His reason for supporting these people is, I think, specifically interesting and unique compared to other AIDS denialists. And so I want to talk about it specifically because he is his denialism is the most consequential of all. He accepted the Weiser's promise of a miracle cure, hook, line, and sinker, and became a prominent supporter of this in future illegal medical trials. I would not call Mbeki anti-science. I would not call him anti-intellectual. I do not think that he was afraid of science or even the scientific establishment. What he was afraid of was the Western medical establishment, because to him, the connotation had nothing to do with corruption or greed alone. It was a matter of race. He grew up in an apartheid-ruled government, in a government by white people who did not care about him or his health or his basic human plight. And so this idea of relying on the Western establishment, poor black people relying on the Western establishment to cure this disease by importing antiretroviral therapies was almost kind of offensive to him. It wasn't about the science at this point. And this is important because this mindset, this fear of the Western establishment planted by the apartheid party that he grew up in, was the lens through which he saw the entire issue, unknowingly, I think. But to him, this whole thing, the reason he was so interested in this is because it was a cure developed in South Africa by South Africans for South Africans. It was it was a cure on its own ground. It was very important, and it was a matter of national pride. When Mbeki became the deputy president under Nelson Mandela, out of the apartheid, this wasn't just, we talk about a liberation movement, but from their perspective, they saw this as they saw South Africa's political and social reform as a beacon of hope and social progress for the entire continent. And when they were faced with this HIV epidemic, when they were faced with the dependency on the importing of antiretroviral therapy from Western pharmaceutical giants, it seemed as though they were being put right back into the back pocket of neocolonialism, or neocolonial control. And so it's not difficult to imagine why he was so opposed to it, why he was so afraid of it. Go back a little bit. I don't want to go quite there yet. That's my spot just a little bit. Oh, okay. Antiretroviral therapy. If you don't know, this was the first viable treatment for HIV and AIDS. Initially, it was slightly toxic and not as effective as it could be, but very, very fast developments in response to a very threatening HIV epidemic that new advancements made it cheaper, safer, and more effective. So much so that shortly after the first ART was invented and distributed, HIV has basically become a manageable condition, no more threatening to your life than diabetes or congenital heart disease. You can live for many, many, many years without it. People who have heart architects in their 40s and then well into their 70s, things like that. HIV is not a death sentence anymore. And after the invention of antiretroviral therapies, it was no longer a death sentence. But it did remain a death sentence in South Africa. The reason is that Mbeki elected to fund projects like the Visor incident rather than accept or purchase antiretroviral therapies from Western or European pharmaceutical companies. Under his administration, he, after taking over, he outright rejected even the donation of antiretroviral therapies into the country. He refused to distribute them, and he had the support of his health minister. And that's the really scary thing. Eventually, I believe in, I want to say 1990, there we go. They were offered lower prices for more effective antiretroviral therapies, which were very affordable, and they rejected those too, citing that they thought that they were highly toxic and actually causing AIDS. Thabo had not only twisted this into a dependent on neocolonial powers, he had turned it into a conspiracy to kill black people. It was poison. It was causing AIDS. The pharmaceutical companies were using this as a testing ground for new dangerous drugs that they didn't want to test on rich white people back at home. We had turned Africa into an animal model. This was the view Mbeki adopted over time, and it became more paranoid. It became more paranoid and more withdrawn. And it all starts because of this desperate fear of some organized neocolonial conspiracy. So, well-organized, funded, government-endorsed, horrifyingly inhumane conspiracy to oppress, dehumanize, and facilitate unthinkable atrocities against African people for profit gain. In some contexts, this seems kind of ridiculous. We talk about the moon landing, a global conspiracy by hundreds of scientists to fake a landing on another planet in order to stick it to the communist powers. In this case, this concept of a global, organized effort at oppressing black people is not unrealistic. If you are African, especially if you are South African, this isn't silly. This is familiar. And it's real. This happened. And it happened for a very long time. Just another example, it was morally acceptable. It was culturally okay. And so this idea that neocolonial powers were there to rob the humanity of black people for their own benefit is not alien, it's not unusual, it's not unrealistic. So the point I want to make here is that Mbeki's fear and paranoia is not a function of stupidity. It's not a function of naivety. This is maladaptive denialism. In the face of personal experience and tragedy, in the face of extraordinary circumstances, in the face of a culture that essentially cultivated this kind of psychological reaction, Mbeki did exactly what almost anyone in his position probably would have done, especially someone not trained in science or the assessment of science. And so over time, because primarily the restriction and refusal to provide antiretroviral therapies I already talked about this. Anyway, he refused to provide them at first because they were too expensive, then because they were toxic and causing AIDS. Because of this, many people died. And in fact, studies have been done to show how many people have died. But eventually they were introduced, but only because the constitutional court or the judicial branch of the government forced the executive branch to administer ART rollout. But that same branch was still in charge of that rollout, so they were extremely empathetic. And so the death toll continued to rise, even after this constitutional court ruling. Several years after that constitutional court ruling, only 28% of people who needed antiretroviral therapies were actually being provided antiretroviral therapies. In neighboring countries, which were also facing catastrophic HIV epidemics, Botswana and Namibia, they did not have denialistic attitudes, and their ART rollout was already 50 to 60%. The difference between 30 and 50 may not seem significant, but it is. It's extremely significant when we're dealing with populations in the millions. The failure to treat 20% of those in need is a catastrophic death toll. It's not hundreds of people. All the while failure to administer ART, the executive branch, primarily through the health minister, was endorsing complementary and alternative medicine. The government's health official was telling the populace not to take ART, providing it, and then saying it's poison, that it's causing AIDS, that the Western establishment is trying to take advantage of you and profiteer from our country, and that African potatoes actually cure AIDS. Easily accessible, traditional African medicine. Simple. Problem practically solves itself, right? This is the position of the health minister of South Africa, serving under President Mbeki from 1999 to 2008. So it's not just a matter of the failure to treat, it's disinformation. People did not know how to prevent getting HIV or giving other people HIV. Because of this misinformation and lack of education, many insane theories have developed in the South African community, such as that if you rape a virgin, that will cure your HIV. This is actually common. I found many pictures on the internet of graffiti that said, "Raping me will not cure your HIV." This is a big problem. These pseudoscientific ideas with the cause of HIV and AIDS and how to deal with it, primarily because of a failure of the health administration there under the executive branch to give the right information. And so even though these ARTs were being made available, the executive branch, Mbeki, and the health minister were making sure that people were very, very unlikely to take advantage of it. So, a little hard to find current statistics. They kind of come out with a few years delay, but as of 2007, the global population of HIV is 33 million. 2/3 of that is Sub-Saharan Africa. South Africa's HIV population is 5.7 million. That's higher than any other country in the world. I believe the current infection rate is about 20%. 20% of the human population in South Africa is HIV positive. 20% of everyone. From 2000, not 200. But from 2000 to 2007, we see a 5-fold increase in AIDS-related deaths. So how bad is that? Well, it dropped the average life expectancy in South Africa by nearly 20 years to the early 50s, from the 70s, which is what we saw in most developed nations. And South Africa was a promising developing nation on the verge of independence. And 17% of everyone with HIV is from South Africa. And this is despite the fact that they only hold about 0.7% of the world's population. 2 separate studies conducted independently looked at the consequences of the failure of the government to roll out antiretroviral therapy in a timely manner. They found or estimated that between 2000 and 2005, the number of deaths caused are between 330 and 343,000 people. And this is a 5-year span that happened over 7 years ago. The thing to remember is that all of these people who failed to receive treatment potentially gave HIV to someone else. This number keeps growing. The descendants of these infected people still exist. This death toll did not stop in 2005. It's getting bigger. And with the time that's gone by now, it's probably close to 1 million people. And that will just keep on rising for many, many years, and it will peter out over time. But the effects of this failure are catastrophic. 2.2 million life years. And I think that that's interesting. If these people were to live side by side, one after another, they could go back before the dawn of human civilization, before the dawn of human evolution. They could go back and see trying not to misquote evolutionary theory here, something different. It's about 900 deaths per day. And I believe as of 2007, that climbed to 1,200 deaths per day in South Africa alone. That is more than any other country, and it is more than every other country combined. That's it.
Thank you. I do have a question,
Yes.
and it may seem obvious to you, but I don't think you covered it. Does the treatment make you any less infectious?
Antiretroviral therapies do reduce the viral load. As to whether or not that reduces the risk of passing on the infection during unprotected intercourse, that I'm actually not quite sure. I imagine a reduced viral load might. Nonetheless, actually, yeah, I think it does reduce the risk of transmitting. One other application here would be in the prevention of passing HIV from mother to child during birth. There were therapies administered that vastly reduced that. So, thinking about it, yes, I think that antiretroviral therapy does reduce the risk of transmission.
Did you find anything that showed why it was so concentrated in South Africa? Because the other parts of Africa were colonial as well. Would have had many of the same issues, but they accepted the drugs. What was the difference?
It partly had to do with the timing. HIV became important in Africa to the rest of the world right almost the same year that the apartheid collapsed and faced the liberation movement. It did not coincide so completely with other sub-Saharan African countries and other African countries. And then also, I think that it's really just a coincidence. I think that there are leaders in Africa, when faced with these problems, who either were simply unequipped to deal with the matter, and so they deferred to the right experts, or a ineffective government kind of just went along with it. But in this case, the executive branch in South Africa had a tremendous amount of power. For example, in in Botswana, I believe, the executive branch does not have the power to approve medical trials. The medical regulatory officials there can say no, and you simply do not have any more options. Whereas in some other African countries, the military is allowed to conduct medical trials without the approval of any other branch of government. These are the other countries where the visors performed additional legal trials by appealing to members of the military. So in South Africa, there are other places where it's as severe in terms of denialism, or the resistance to roll out was as severe, or the denialists that took advantage of it were severe, but the combination of denialism, population, migrant labor workers, and just the recency of the apartheid within a year, I think just made it the prime location. And places like Namibia and Botswana, which neighbor South Africa, aren't spared. Their HIV rates are now as high as 10%. It's just not nearly as close as South Africa, which is nearly 17 to 20% today, I believe. So I think it's just the right combination of factors. They all faced denialism. Not all. Some actually were very responsive to antiretroviral therapy.
Do you know what the rate of infection is here in the U.S.?
Could
you compare that to?
I'm able to pull it up right now. I have a map. It's quite low. It's less than 1%. I believe.
Oh.
Let's see. Newly infected in 2009. And these are
Oh, my goodness.
less than 200.
Wow.
Compared to the
Wow.
between 190 and 460,000 in South Africa, or sub-Saharan Africa, I'd say. Predominantly in South Africa itself. So, like I said, in developed countries with access to antiretroviral therapies, HIV is nearly irrelevant. You could go out right now and have all the unprotected crazy sex you want, and you would probably not get HIV. It's just not as common in our society anymore. And this is the number of newly infected individuals. I don't know how many have it. I probably have that somewhere. But it's quite low. Because people understand what it is. They understand that it's an STD. But even there are many, many STDs in America that are more prominent than HIV. So it's an easily manageable disease. We don't have a cure, but prevention and treatment is not in the Stone Age. The problem in South Africa is not that HIV is aggressive. It's that the treatment isn't available, that the public has not been educated, that the government has fostered paranoid ideas about neo-colonial powers. They actually did studies, and I think 33% of black respondents in South Africa said that they thought it was very likely that HIV was the plot of a Western profiteering initiative. 33%. The same as, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to point out that this particular slide, since it is a sexually transmitted disease, would not reflect the number of new cases in adults. This is just showing the children.
Oh, does it?
Yeah.
You can see that.
The other thing, I believe, perhaps you have more information regarding this. When it did start spreading into Europe and North America, wasn't there some evidence that it was coming through Italy, through Rome at one point? Have you ever heard of that?
Oh, yeah, there was, and it was very kind of fuzzy. People didn't quite understand the route of transmission, and there was evidence of it transmitting through various routes in this kind of search for patient zero. And I don't know a whole lot about that. I know a little bit about the association with homosexuals in the early discovery of AIDS. It was actually called GRID early on, gay-related immunodeficiency syndrome, or GRIDS. And again, at the time, it was a valid description of what was going on. We had very, very few cases. Most of them were active young gay men having unprotected sex. And why wouldn't they? There was no reason not to. So I'm more familiar with that. As far as the route from Africa, I'm not quite sure.
I was just curious, because my math professor or teacher in high school in Rome, actually, looking back on his illness, was probably struck with AIDS. That was 1979. So.
Yeah, it's clear that HIV had already become a global infection before the first description of AIDS. It was not prominent, it was not affecting a huge number of people, but it was already, the seeds of HIV had already been planted throughout most of the world. In fact, something as much as I think 3 or 4% of South Africa might have already been infected. But nobody noticed. South Africa, the least of all. And regarding the current number of infected individuals, here's a chart of this. The one I was showing with new infections was children. I didn't see that. But this is adults and children with HIV today. And 2 million is not a small number, but again, it's a manageable disease. Sub-Saharan Africa, 22.5 million. There are a lot more people living here. This represents a much larger proportion of the South African population compared to ours. The population of America is, I would guesstimate 750 million, approximately. So that's a very small proportion of people. And we see in other countries that have this issue, for instance, the Caribbean and Central America, which currently is threatened with a very, very increasing rate of HIV infection, very high numbers, 220 to 270,000. And that number is going very, very fast. It's increasing almost twofold a year right now. And then in other developed countries, the number is very small. Western Europe, even in, if you look at South America, they were very responsive to the rollout of antiretroviral therapy, and their HIV is comparable to ours.
You mentioned mothers passing on to their children. Did you find any information on what age a child could start taking the therapy?
No, I didn't actually. Yeah, I'm not quite sure. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, because if they have to be 4 or 5 before they get therapy, they could be
Well, the medication is for the mother before she gives birth. Because if you are born of an HIV-positive mother, you can get HIV through the birth process.
Yes, but if they don't find it until after that.
Oh, as far as if
Then-
you know you're a baby, I'm actually not sure when you could administer it.
So you can actually start giving it even in infants, actually. So,
Yeah, I imagine you would need
it's
to.
immediate. You can, as soon as you know that they have it, you can start administering the antiviral therapy.
Because it's not particularly toxic.
Oh, really?
Unlike original formulations, AZT was one at first.
Mhm.
It was relatively toxic. It had some side effects, but new drugs are not really all that toxic at all. They're quite safe.
With such a high percentage of people in Africa being affected, do they have adequate blood screening sort of procedures to prevent infection via transfusions?
They do. Initially, they did not. But after the operating medical establishment in South Africa was actually very scientific, and they supported antiretroviral therapy, and they were pressuring the government to cooperate. They simply refused to provide those resources to South Africa. So the medical establishment there knew what they were doing, and the blood screens that were available were used properly and effectively. Early infection through blood transmission have occurred though, but it's no longer really an issue. Yeah, it's not a huge concern.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Chalmer, would you tell us what your podcast, name of your podcast is?
Oh yeah, I should use this opportunity to plug some.
Plug your podcast.
So myself and two of my other colleagues have a podcast called the Mile High Sanity Project. MileHighSanityProject.com. We talk about issues of ethics. I talk about conspiracy theories. We talk about complementary alternative medicine. But the point of the podcast is to apply basic critical thinking skills as laymen to contemporary issues to try to show how a normal person can navigate the complexities of modern issues. Most recently, we interviewed Richard Dawkins and Catherine Stewart. We've also talked with people like Michael Chalmer and James Randi. So check it out, and I hope you enjoy it.
That's a Facebook page, right?
Yeah, so has a Facebook page, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much.